Welcome to my study. I haven't been doing camera videos for quite a while, but I thought I'd do one as we near the end of the semester. I miss face-to-face contact with all of you, and you might have a similar experience, so I'll start out this video talking into a camera instead of just voicing over notes that I use for the course. So today we're going to talk about Donald Davidson. Davidson is Quine's most famous student, by far. Nobody comes close to Donald Davidson. Davidson is also really instrumental in changing Oxford philosophy from ordinary language philosophy to more like the philosophy that we see being done in America at Harvard, Princeton, maybe Yale counts as one of the centers, but now the centers would be places like NYU and Rutgers. In any case, Davidson went to Oxford to give a set of lectures in the 1960s. I think it was 1966. I'm not sure. But the Oxford philosophers were blown away by Davidson's work. In fact, the lectures are called the Davidsonic boom, which is kind of a fun way to refer to what happened. In any case, it's worth looking at Davidson's work to see something about the intersection of mind and language that comes to dominate or has come to dominate already philosophy, both analytic philosophy and philosophy done in the analytic tradition. We're going to look at Davidson today, and then the last two philosophers we'll look at will be Hilary Putnam and David Lewis. David Lewis is by far the most important philosopher of the last 30 years or so, 25 years of the 20th century. So his work is going to be especially important for us to get some introduction to. So today we're going to look at Davidson's paper on mental events. He's written on lots of things. When you look at the notes, you'll see there are also notes from Actions, Reasons, and Causes, which is another really famous paper. But we're just going to limit ourselves here to mental events. So let's take a look at the notes. The notes also contain notes on Philippa Foot's paper, Morality is a System of Hypothetical Imperatives. If you're interested in that, you can take a look at that as well. But here we'll talk about Donald Davidson's paper, Mental Events. Davidson holds that there are three principles that have to be accounted for, and he's going to offer a theory that tries to explain how these three principles can all be endorsed. First principle is the principle of causal interaction. At least some mental events interact causally with physical events. Examples of such forms of causation, perception and action in particular. So your physical environment interacts with your sensory equipment, your eyes, for example. And as a result, you have a mental experience. You see a tree in the yard, you see a car going down the road, those sorts of things. Action is the same sort of thing. Things in the environment happen and you react with actions, and actions typically are undergirded by mental events of one sort or another, perhaps beliefs and desires. Furthermore, Davidson holds it's arguable that all mental events are ultimately, perhaps through causal relations with other mental events, causally related to physical events. So maybe everything mental is also, in some sense or other, connected to the physical. That shouldn't surprise us, I guess. I'm not sure that there's a good argument for the universal claim here, but universal claims are notoriously hard to defend epistemically. In any case, let's go with that. I mean, we're in some sense embodied beings, whether you're a dualist or a physicalist or whatever. Nobody doubts that we're embodied creatures. We have a physical body and things happen to us in our mental lives in ways that are connected with our physical lives as well. So the first one is the principle of causal interaction. The second is the principle of the nomological character of causality. The second is the principle of the nomological character of causality. Events related as cause and effect fall under strict laws. Now, I'm going to put a question mark beside this because this is something I'm going to return to later on. What is it for a law to be a strict law? We're going to come back to that later on. But in any case, let's go with the law-like character of causation. So causation relates specific events under the laws that characterize the relationship, and the laws themselves are strict laws. They're not, I assume what that means is at least that they are not subject to exceptions of any sort. So if there's a law of nature connecting events of type A with events of type B, there aren't any examples of A events that aren't B events, so long as the A event encodes everything that would be in the antecedent of a law of nature. So the laws of nature are going to be necessary, and one of the features, necessary in some sense, nomologically necessary as we usually call it. The reason we call it nomological is because nomos is the Latin word for law. So the laws of nature have a kind of necessity suitable for such physical laws, whatever that kind of necessity is. And one of the governing principles about necessity of any sort is necessarily P always implies P. It would be hard to imagine what notion of necessity you might be thinking about where you didn't get that implication. In any case, the third point to notice is the anomalous character of the mental. There are no strict laws, Davidson claims, on the basis of which mental events can be predicted or explained. So you can think of that as behavior is anomalous in certain respects. Mental events are anomalous, unpredictable, inexplicable in some sense or other. Presumably, the motivation for this view has something to do with our general understanding of human freedom, that there are things that are under our control. We're not just automatons or automata, I guess that would be the plural, but rather we exert control over things in our lives. Given these three principles, Davidson characterizes the alternatives in terms of a little matrix of possibilities. On the one hand, there are those who assert and those who deny the existence of psychophysical laws. On the other hand, there are those who say mental events are identical with physical and those who deny this. So we have fans of psychophysical laws, laws that link the mental and the physical, and we have identity theorists and those who deny such identities. Theories thus divide into four sorts. So Davidson is going to use the word nomological for the people who affirm the existence of psychophysical laws, and he's going to use the adjective anomalous for those who deny the existence of such laws. So we get nomological and anomalous positions. And then for identity theorists, if you're an identity theorist, then he's going to call you a monist. And if you're not an identity theorist, he's going to call you a dualist. These terms are perhaps a bit unfortunate because the history of the language of monism connects it with a denial of pluralism, not a denial of dualism. And dualism is connected to the language of doubles, two. But if you're not a monist, you might think there's two features in question, but you might also think that there's more than two. So Davidson is here trying to characterize logical space, and certainly those who, the difference between being a nomologist, a nomologicist, and its denial, maybe that's fine. That'll carve up logical space. But the distinction between monists and dualists does not carve up logical space. Presumably, dualism is the most attractive version of non-identity theories, but it's certainly not the only logically possible way of denying identity theories. To deny identity theories is just to embrace that mind and body aren't identical. And notice the list of people that Davidson is going to count as dualists: parallelists, interactionists, and epiphenomenalists. All of these positions hold that there are two aspects of reality, the mental and the physical. But it's certainly imaginable, and some of you may be familiar with religious traditions that posit more than two dimensions, more than one aspect of the world that is not physical. So among the not physical might be the stuff of the mind, but we have other terms. We have mind, soul, spirit. Perhaps you can imagine, or maybe you're even acquainted with various metaphysical positions that deny the identity of all of these. In any case, Davidson defines 4 parts of logical space. And maybe the right way to think of his language of dualism is that it's just a term being used without meaning to convey the idea of two-ness, but just the idea of non-identity. So we have nomological monism, which affirms that there are psychophysical laws and also affirms the identity theory. Nomological dualism, which affirms psychophysical laws but denies identity. Anomalous dualism, which denies both identity and psychophysical laws. And anomalous monism, which embraces identity but denies psychophysical laws. That's the position that is new, and the logical space being opened up by Davidson's discussion was not recognized until Davidson's work. The key here to notice this possible place in in logical space is the distinction between types and tokens of events. So laws, by their very nature, relate types of events because they're generalizations of a sort. Prior to Davidson, to be an identity theorist was also to articulate a type level claim. It was to claim that mental events of type X were identical with physical events of type X. So to believe that 2 + 2 = 4 is just to be in a particular kind of brain state. What Davidson notes is there are both types and token events. So even if we hold that laws have to be articulated at the type level, it doesn't follow from that, or isn't constrained by that fact, to clarify the identity theory in terms of tokens of events. And notice the background that we find in the history of analytic philosophy makes it hard to find space for this position. It wouldn't have occurred to people, because remember, we had the a priori and the a posteriori being identified with analytic and synthetic, which is also to be identified with the distinction between necessity, use a box to stand for necessity, and contingency. Contingency is a lack of necessity plus truth. Now, if all of those are the same, and we understand identity itself to be a necessary feature, then any identity claim will have to be found up here. So if the identity theory of mind and brain is to be endorsed, it will have to be endorsed on the basis of some sort of analyticity. Analyticity is a feature of sentences that has to hold at the type level. There's no way around that. So you can't say it's an analytic truth that Mark Twain is Sam Clemens. Those are names. So whatever you're going to say Mark Twain is Sam Clemens if you're a logical empiricist, but you're going to have a hard time defending that unless you give a particular construal of names that'll be different. So think of demonstratives that clearly pick out token things or events. So you use the word this. What are you talking about? I'm talking about this. Oh, I thought you were talking about that. So could a sentence of the sort, this is identical to that, be true in a way that preserved analyticity? Demonstratives, as well as proper names, cause peculiar kinds of difficulties for logical empiricist accounts, because if identity has to be necessary and anything necessary has to be analytic, we're going to have a hard time accounting for lots of identities that we know to be true, like ones about Sam Clemens and Mark Twain, Clark Kent and Superman, Cicero and Tully. Those are going to be hard things to defend as analytic truths, and yet they look to be correct identity claims. Once we break with this logical empiricist tradition, we're in a position where we can distinguish between types and tokens of events, as well as token-level kinds of things, wherein we assert identities between this and that and between Mark Twain and Sam Clemens. Those are not type-level claims. Instead, they talk about particular individual singular items of a sort which makes them resemble token events rather than type events. So we can have identities at the token level, even if all of our law-like statements have to be at the type level. That opens up an aspect of logical space that hadn't been noticed and couldn't be accommodated, or at least couldn't be accommodated easily, in the logical empiricist tradition and the way in which it identifies each of these distinctions with each other. So this is the big breakthrough that we find in Davidson's paper, Mental Events. Identity might hold even if law-likeness doesn't, and vice versa. Logical space allows for all of these positions. Notice as well that this makes it much easier to be an identity theorist than would have been true on logical empiricist grounds. I remember when I was in grad school reading accounts of identity theories. J.J.C. Smart had a really famous one where you just identify mental states with brain states at the type level. And it seemed ludicrous to anyone who thought necessity and analyticity had to go hand in hand. Because when we talk about brain states, C fiber firings, and that sort of thing, those remarks are obviously not synonymous with whatever mental states they're perfectly correlated with in the way that an identity theory would require. So you're seeing a tree in your front yard, and that's supposed to be the same event as certain patterns of irradiation on your retina and various C fiber firings going on in the brain. And those two kinds of remarks are the most obviously non-synonymous kinds of remarks you can get. Merely understanding the terms gives you no clue whether or not the identity claim would be true. And so the identity theory on logical empiricist assumptions linking analyticity and necessity looked hopeless. Once you abandon that way of thinking, and you now start thinking about the possibility of token identity theories aren't as ludicrous as they seemed in the 50s and 60s under logical empiricist assumptions. Now, Davidson spends some time criticizing various discussions for ignoring the type-token distinction and the possibilities that it opens up. But in any case, the important thing isn't the people that he's criticizing, but what reasons he thinks can be given for his anomalous monism position. Here's his fundamental stance on things. First, causal relations have to relate strict laws. Strict relations between mental and physical events have to be strict. Yet, such laws can't be psychological or psychophysical laws, laws in which mental concepts figure. Remember the 3 pieces of data that we began with at the beginning of the article. So he gets A from 1 and 2, and he gets B from 3. Strict laws are only found in the physical sciences, he holds. If you started looking at his 3 pieces of data and you weren't convinced that they were actually pieces of data that have to be accommodated, then you won't be moved very much by this argument. So maybe there's something you'd be moved by, but you'd try to characterize things differently. For example, here's one sort of thing. So suppose you have causal relations between C and E. We use C and E for cause and effect. So if there's a causal relation between those two options present themselves. There is a causal relation, but no law-like connection. Or there's a causal relation here, causal relationship, which instantiates a law. And the law will have nomological necessity to it, and it'll look something like this. It's nomologically necessary that any occurrence of an event which has the features of our cause will be followed by an event which has the features of our effect. So we get universal regularities that are nomologically necessary. Now ask yourself, what is it for the law to be a strict one? Notice what I did. When I characterized the law, I characterized it in terms of necessity, a universal quantifier, a conditional, where the antecedent was limited to something having to do with the features of the cause, and the consequent to something having to do with features of the effect. Now, if that's what it means for a law to be a strict one, you might want to distance yourself from the view. Because there are both fundamental sciences, perhaps there are fundamental sciences, but let's at least leave open the possibility that there is a fundamental science. And presumably, if there is one, it'll be physics. So let's suppose there is a fundamental science, but there's also non-fundamental sciences. All of the social sciences are non-fundamental. Chemistry is not fundamental. If physics is fundamental, chemistry is built on top of physics. Biology is built on top of physics and chemistry, and so on. And presumably anthropology, sociology, psychology, they're all built on top of the physical sciences. Now, suppose you come to a non-basic, a non-fundamental science, and you ask about the laws that we can find. What do the laws look like in, say, biology? Well, we have some idea of what these look like. That's what Darwinian evolutionary theory and its successors look like. So the grand synthesis is one that combines random mutations with survival of the fittest, the fundamental Darwinian mechanism. So the fundamental Darwinian mechanism isn't sufficient. It's really random genetic drift plus survival pressures that is part of the grand synthesis. So you get laws of nature at the biological level that talk about this combination of things. Now the question is, what are you supposed to do when you're thinking about biological mechanisms and the like, and yet there's intrusion into the relevant system. You've got a biological system, but there's an intrusion from a more fundamental level, either at the chemical level or at the level of particle physics. What happens to the law-like relationships that are being posited in biology? The answer is that they fail. So let's take a very simple example about life in general. So you think about various pieces of animal behavior, and I don't know how you want to understand these sorts of things. Maybe you do it in behaviorist terms, maybe you do it in terms of belief-desire complexes in animals. I don't know how you're supposed to describe that, but it doesn't matter how you describe it. So let's just do it in terms of belief-desire complexes. You find a person who wants to get rid of a headache, so that's a desire, and believes that taking Tylenol will help, and you notice that the person has a headache, and so you predict that they're going to take Tylenol. So you have a certain, certainly this isn't an adequate psychological law or law governing behavior either in humans or animals, but it's about as close as we're going to get. So suppose you've got a law like that, but then you have a sniper putting a bullet into the brain of the individual that you're examining. Pretty clearly the predicted behavior is not going to be engaged in because the biological system ceases to be alive because of the bullet to the brain. So what are you supposed to say about that? Well, people like Fodor say laws can't have exceptions to them. So our understanding of the strictness, the exceptionless character of the laws, is going to require in the antecedent of the law a ceteris paribus clause. So if you're wanting a law to link causes and effects, you're going to have both the features of the law and a remark to the effect that there's no intrusion into the relevant system that the special science is describing, no intrusion from outside the system, and then you get the expected effects within the system. So laws describe exceptionless regularities within systems, but you only get necessity for laws that have ceteris paribus clauses in their antecedents. Those are the kinds of strict laws that you're going to get if you're going to get any laws at all. When you read Davidson and you look for clues on whether he's aware of this way of thinking about the difference between those who affirm psychophysical laws and those who deny it, you don't see any sign of such a distinction. So maybe the reason some people deny psychophysical laws is because they recognize the possibility of intrusion into a psychological system from outside that system. Bullets to the brain would be one sort of intrusion. Presumably irradiation by radioactive material at the fundamental particle physics level would also count as an intrusion from outside the system. If you have psychological laws that have ceteris paribus clauses in them, you don't have to say that such examples undermine reasonable commitment to psychophysical laws. But if you don't recognize the possibility of ceteris paribus laws, then you have to say such intrusion shows that there aren't any psychophysical laws at all. So in Davidson's argument, one thing to ask about is when he's talking about strict laws and those who deny the existence of psychophysical laws, is there suitable sensitivity to this possibility of there being strict laws, but only laws that have ceteris paribus clauses when we're talking about the special sciences? And clearly, psychophysical laws are going to be laws for a special science. Particle physics doesn't give us these laws. You're going to have to get up to the level where you find psychology and those kinds of special sciences before you can formulate these laws. In any case, Davidson's view is that strict laws are only found in the physical sciences. That gives us a hint. I mean, the physical sciences, just take Well, geology, I guess, is one. Chemistry is one. Physics is one. Are there strict laws in chemistry? Probably no more than there are in psychology or biology. Once you start recognizing the possibility of intrusion in the system, in the relevant system from outside the system, from aspects that are properly characterized in terms of the laws of physics rather than chemistry, maybe you'll think, yeah, there could be intrusion into lots of the physical sciences. So maybe the laws there aren't going to be strict either. It depends on what Davidson is thinking strictness involves and how it's relating to the possibility of laws that encode ceteris paribus conditions in their antecedent. That's a confounding factor for the argument and position that Davidson is articulating. Nothing he says tells us what to think about or make of this alternative conception of laws. Thus, he concludes, on the basis of this argument, the mental events involved in causal interactions with physical events must be describable in purely physical terms if we're able to formulate the relevant strict laws. But that just means that those mental events have to be identical to physical events. The identity, however, couldn't be at the type level. It would have to be at the token level. So you get both anomalousness and monism resulting from this argument. Because the strict laws, there just aren't going to be any. So any identity that you find is going to have to be token level rather than type level. Most people, on hearing this, will question the commitment to anomalism. So why is it that Davidson is an anomalous? That's a hard thing to say. An anomalist. Anomalist. Why is he that? He has two reasons. One is an argument from holism, and the second is an argument from rationality. Now, the least explained one, the hardest one to grasp here, I think, is the second one. So let's take a look at them in order and see if we can make sense of them. So first, the argument from holism. Individual beliefs and desires issue in, i.e., cause behavior only in the presence of other beliefs and desires and other attitudes. In fact, any putative connections between a set of mental events and behavior is always defeasible by the presence of further mental events. This is an important point that led in the philosophy of mind in the 1960s to the move from behaviorism to functionalism. Functionalism in the philosophy of mind gives us a picture of the connection between mental entities and the behavior that results from them that doesn't require eliminating reference to mental events and the like, but just links those things as functional items that get us from, say, sensory input or stimuli of whatever sort to the kinds of responses that behaviorists were talking about. So behaviorists said, we don't even need to talk about mental items or events. All we have to do is characterize stimulus-response connections. Functionalists said, yes, we do need to talk about mental entities because they control the function that links the two. But the link is always defeasible by the presence of further events. So take the simple case that I gave you of where you have a headache, that's the stimulus, and you want to get rid of your headache, that's your desire, and you believe that taking Tylenol is the best way to do that. So we predict you're going to take Tylenol. That's the response to all of this. But you know that that's defeasible by the presence of further mental events. Imagine you're part of a strange Christian cult that says taking anything as medicine other than the things that grow in the ground. Call this a completely organic, naturalistic cult about what medicines are approved by God. If you're a member of this cult, Tylenol doesn't grow in your garden. It's manufactured. It's not a natural organic element, so you can't take it. That would be a sin. Notice, add that to the mix, and the predicted behavior of taking the Tylenol is no longer to be expected. So the first one, individual beliefs and desires, don't atomistically connect with behavior. They only do so in connection with an entire complex or system of beliefs and desires, where the prompting beliefs and desires are not subject to defeat by anything else in the entire noetic structure. Noetic here from the Greek word noesis. I think that's the Greek word. I forgot the Greek word. Anyway, it's the Greek word for mind. Nous. Nous, from the Greek word nous, for mind. Okay, good. I got the Greek word back at least. This means the holistic part, the explicit appeal to the defeasibility of the link between any particular beliefs and desires and the behavior associated with them. That means that the generalizations linking the presence of certain beliefs and desires with the occurrence of a specific form of behavior will always be subject to exceptions. Strict laws, by contrast, are exceptionless laws that form a closed and comprehensive theory. So here's our best remark to date about what a strict law involves. First, they're exceptionless, and the system that they describe is closed. Once you start thinking about it that way, it's hard to think of the possibility of there being any strict laws for any science except at the fundamental level. So if physics is the fundamental level, maybe the system being described there is closed so that you could have exceptionless laws, strict laws at that level. But every special science is a science regarding systems which can be intruded on from the outside by more fundamental level systems that the more fundamental level sciences describe. This remark makes me think maybe Davidson isn't thinking of strict laws as being capable of having ceteris paribus clauses in their antecedents. If that's true, we aren't going to be able to get strict laws anywhere for any of the non-fundamental sciences. Only fundamental sciences could have strict laws. That's a weakness in Davidson's characterization of the relationship between science's laws, causality, and especially the kinds of psychophysical laws we're discussing here. In any case, that's the argument from holism. The other argument is the argument from the principle of rationality. So let's take a look at it. If strict psychophysical laws existed, this would open the possibility of reading people's beliefs and desires off their brains. We could, in principle, determine whether a person has a certain belief by ascertaining which neural state she is in, independently of the question as to whether the person is rational or not. You wouldn't need to assess levels of rationality in order to determine whether or not they held a particular belief. That, Davidson thinks, is impossible. So he thinks attributions of attitudes like belief or desire are controlled by a requirement for rationality and coherence. Unless we assume that a person is rational, it doesn't seem to be possible to say what the significance is of ascribing any particular belief or desire to her. That is, our very idea of what it is for a person to have a certain belief or desire can't be divorced from considerations about that person's rationality. Now that's a foggy kind of claim here. It's not clear to me what to make of it. Do we have to assume that a person is rational in order to ascribe a belief or desire to them? Initially, you should start out with the assumption that people are capable of being completely nuts. I remember when I was a young assistant professor, and there was a medical doctor in College Station, Texas. And he had an interest in philosophy, so he also became a grad student in philosophy at the University of Texas in Austin. And it turned out this doctor, by the way, he was one of the founding doctors for the medical school that was opened at Texas A&M. So he was a pretty important medical community person in College Station. And he went to grad school, and he was becoming interested in various sorts of psychological ailments that people have. So he was dealing with people that were paranoid schizophrenics. And he came and showed us some slides and pictures and gave a talk on the inner mental life of a certain paranoid schizophrenic that he was dealing with. And that paranoid schizophrenic had created a map of the universe, a map of the cosmos, in big poster boards that covered the entire wall of the room that he was in. The wall was about maybe 20 feet long, and I suppose it was an 8-foot wall, but he had poster board put up on the wall, and then he had taken the finest point ballpoint pen he could get and written in the smallest, most meticulous print font he could, drawing connections between all of the things that he thought were linked in the cosmos. And it was a bizarre, really intricate set of posters, but there were links on there, like cancer was being linked with canned foods, and carnation evaporated milk was linked to the doctrine of the incarnation. And I think you can see what the connections are. They're just certain sorts of, like, cancer starts with CAN, so canned foods turn out to be one of the things causing cancer. That looks like an appropriate interpretation of the connections that are being made. Same thing for carnation evaporated milk. Incarnation contains the word carnation, so maybe there's some connection between the two. I don't know what the connection would be. But now think of using a drawn map with arrows and lines connecting various items on it to attribute beliefs to this paranoid schizophrenic, whom you grant is, at some level, completely irrational. Does there have to be a kind of rationality that you are ascribing when you attribute these beliefs and desires? Davidson thinks the answer to that is yes. And I guess the way the argument would go, I guess the way the claim would go is, look, you've got lines drawn between cancer and canned foods. So the incidence of cancer has seemed to have gone up during the 20th century, but so has the use of canned foods that we eat. So there's a connection. And aren't you thereby attributing a kind of rationality, at least in this limited respect, that there's some underlying statistical basis for why the guy is linking canned foods with cancer? Maybe the answer to that is yes. Maybe every time you attribute a belief or a desire to a person, you are presupposing some minimal level of rationality being displayed at the local level. Maybe you grant that overall this person is not fully in control of their faculties and not really rational at bottom. But in this limited respect, there's a flicker of rationality that you can detect that is helping you decide whether to attribute or withhold a certain belief or desire to the person. That's the best I can do, and it's a murky argument. Whether or not it's compelling or not, he thinks this is, if you accept it, a really strong reason for questioning the possibility of psychophysical laws. Because if there are psychophysical laws, we could read off people's beliefs from their brain states. Notice, however, that if the identity theory is true, so if you knew that, I don't know how you'd know this, but if you'd know that brain state 1 is identical with mental state 14, if you knew those at the token level, if you could somehow get access to that information, then of course you could read off the mental state from the brain state on that basis. Now, maybe the problem is maybe Davidson thinks you have to be committed to the identity. You should be committed to the identity theory at the token level, but you're never going to know what any of these specific identities are, so you're never going to be able to read off people's beliefs and desires from their brain states. That would require positing a certain kind of intrinsic limitation on possibilities of knowledge. And what would you say? Does that mean omniscience is not possible? Or at least omniscience, knowledge of certain things, is not possible for humans? Maybe if you're a divine being, it's possible. There's lots of interesting stuff that gets raised by this position of anomalous monism. But the most interesting fact of all here is it opens up a region of logical space that hadn't been considered before. And for that reason alone, it's an enormously significant paper. If you're interested in more Davidson, you can take a look at Actions, Reasons, and Causes, which is also a really important paper, part of the key canon for action theory. But we're not going to take a look at that. What we'll do is turn to Putnam and Lewis in our next